The moment I heard the blood-curdling screams, I knew two things for certain. First, that Karen Mitchell's HOA-sanctioned beach party had finally gone off the rails. And second, that my legal alligators were officially having a busier day than I was. Freeze frame. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how we got here. More importantly, you might be asking yourself, how did a bunch of suburban transplants throwing beach parties end up bleeding into a conservation zone protected by state law, with live alligators circling like patient old gods beneath the lake's surface? Good question. But to answer it, we have to go back to before the tiki bars, the jet skis, the fireworks, and the lawsuits. Back to when it was just me, the water, and the silence. When I first found the land by Blackthorn Lake, it felt like I had stumbled into a hidden room of the world. You know the kind. A place so tucked away, so defiantly wild, it felt like even time had forgotten it. The road that led there was barely more than a scar through the trees, a gravel track that most folks mistook for a dead end, the kind of road that didn't welcome strangers so much as dare them to keep going. No neon signs, no perfectly spaced mailboxes, no cookie-cutter homes lined up like mournful teeth. Just raw, untamed wilderness. Towering pines reaching like arms toward the heavens, gnarled oaks that looked older than memory, and the lake, Blackthorn they called it, resting like a sleeping beast between the trees. It wasn't much to look at by city standards, muddy in parts, rocky in others, deep as the truth and twice as dark. But the moment I stepped onto that soil, it felt like the land leaned toward me and whispered, "You're home." I didn't buy the land with grand plans or a Pinterest board of cabin aesthetics. I just wanted silence, real, soul-thick silence. The kind you only find in places too stubborn to be tamed. So I built my cabin myself, one plank, one rusty nail, one bleeding thumb at a time. Not because I'm some romantic woodsman type, but because I needed to know every inch of that place, needed the wood under my feet to remember my hands. It took months. Timber came down with the groaning reluctance of trees that had seen too many storms. The walls went up like stubborn mules, every corner off by a sliver that gave the place character. No blueprint could have designed what I built. I just let the land tell me what it wanted, and I listened. Back then, I didn't have neighbors. Half a mile in any direction, it was just me and whatever moved between the trees. Deer that came down at dusk, turtles sunning on flat rocks, herons slicing through the air like feathered arrows. I'd sit on my porch in the early evening, mug of black coffee in hand, and feel something rare, stillness. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. If you've never felt that kind of quiet, I can't explain it. It doesn't just fill the space around you. It seeps into your bones, rewrites the rhythm of your heart. And Blackthorn Lake, for all its darkness and mystery, gave me that. Until it didn't. The change didn't come like a thunderclap. It crept in, slow, polite, wrapped in smiles and neighborhood bulletins. One morning, I walked out with my coffee and found a new sign hammered into the dirt like a declaration of war. Welcome to Blackthorn Shores Community. A deed-restricted neighborhood. I stared at it for a long time. The steam rising from my mug started to die as the realization sunk in. I hadn't sold anything. I hadn't signed away an inch of this land. But while I was busy splitting logs and mending fences, someone had been buying up the old cabins down the road, bulldozing them, replacing them with pastel monstrosities that looked like they'd been cloned from a Florida HOA catalog. And with those homes came something worse than development. They brought Karen Mitchell. You might know a Karen, or think you do, but you don't know this Karen. Not until you've seen her standing ankle-deep in protected reeds, wearing wedge sandals, and declaring she feels spiritually connected to water-based community spaces. Karen wasn't just a woman. She was a force. Her voice could strip paint. Her emails were weaponized passive aggression. Her smile was a trap baited with vegan cookies and HOA bylaws. She saw Blackthorn not as a wild, sacred place, but as an undeveloped opportunity. And she came armed with newsletters, committees, and a vision of community cohesion that smelled like cheap wine and mandatory potlucks. The first few months, I ignored her. Figured they'd tire out once they realized this place didn't want to be tamed. HOA flyers began appearing in my mailbox, cheerfully printed, aggressively optimistic, full of exciting community plans for dock installations, group bonfires, and shared watercraft storage. All on land that wasn't theirs. I let it slide. What's one newsletter when you've got 30 acres of solitude? But then came the mixers. The lakeside socials. SUVs and minivans clogging up the gravel road, engines grumbling like tourists in the wrong season. Folding tables sprouting like mushrooms. Balloons tied to trees that had stood since before electricity. Country music blasting across the water, shattering the frog song and loon cries like cheap glass. I watched it all from my porch, unmoving, a statue carved from stubborn and spite. And that's when she came up the hill. Karen Mitchell with her sash, clipboard, and that smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Isn't this wonderful?" She chirped, arms flung wide as if she'd summoned the very sun. "We're bringing the community together." I nodded toward the battered private property sign nailed to the oak behind her. You're on my land. She laughed like I'd told a dad joke. Oh, pish posh, it's just a little lakeside fun. Besides, the community owns the water, right? That's when I knew we weren't speaking the same language. I tried explaining, gently at first, that I owned everything up to the high water mark. That the access trails they kept stomping down were legally mine. But she was already turning away, barking orders into her phone, rallying her loyal minions with the zeal of a suburban cult leader. The first party I let go. Maybe they'd get it out of their system. Maybe the bugs, mud, and algae stench would teach them faster than I could. But Karen saw grace as weakness. A quiet man, to her, was a blank page to overwrite. And so they escalated. Next party had jet skis. Next one had fireworks. The one after that, tiki torches and a rented generator. With each event, they pushed deeper. Spray painting trees. Digging fire pits. Bringing in bounce houses and hot dog carts and trash that never left. And with every inch they took, I felt something ancient stir, not in the lake but in me. People like Karen always think they're in charge. They have rules, committees, signatures. They mistake control for power. But out here, power isn't printed. It's lived. It's earned in silence, in mud, in blood and tooth. And Blackthorn? She doesn't care about signatures. She answers to older laws. I didn't fight back right away. Because that's not how the forest fights. It waits. It watches. It lets you make your noise, throw your party, build your paper castle. And when the time is right, it swallows you whole. That's what Karen never understood. And by the time she did, it was already far too late. So now you've seen the end. You've heard the screams. But the real story, the one that matters, starts right here. With a man, a lake, and a line no HOA ever should have crossed. Let me tell you what happens when fake power meets real wilderness. And when something sacred gets pissed off. The first real sign that things had begun to rot beneath the surface wasn't the fireworks or the noise, or even the beer cans that floated into my cove like bloated, empty corpses. It was a sound. Subtle at first. Barely more than a whisper against the wind. A drone, low and persistent, crawling in through the cracks of my cabin windows at dusk, and settling behind my teeth like a vibration I couldn't spit out. Generators. Multiple. The kind you use when you're not just having a party, but building an occupation. That's when I stopped watching and started recording. The next morning, I walked down the trail, boots crunching on gravel still wet from the night's dew, and found a man unloading plastic fencing from the back of an ATV. He wore mirrored sunglasses and had that unbothered, two-tanned look of someone who'd made peace with being a nuisance. I asked him who gave permission to fence off the shoreline. He shrugged like a man who's been paid to not know. Karen said it's all good, man. Whole event's HOA approved. I didn't bother arguing. Arguing with muscle was like shouting at the shovel after the grave's been dug. Instead, I took photos, fencing, speaker towers, signs zip-tied to trees that hadn't seen a nail in 100 years. One of them said Blackthorn blowout entry with wristband only. Another listed the events: jet ski races, beer pong tournament, lakeside yoga, live DJ, and the main attraction, midnight fireworks over the water. Fireworks. Over a registered wildlife zone. I called the county that same hour. Spoke to a woman named Debbie who sounded like her patience had been chewed up and spit out by 6 previous callers. I gave her the coordinates, the dates, the event name. She sighed before I could even finish. Sir, she said in the flat tone of bureaucratic surrender, you're not the only one to call. We've logged several complaints about this HOA already. It's under review. Review. That's government speak for no one wants to touch it. I thanked her and hung up, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of the noise, though there was plenty, but because I was starting to realize this wasn't just ignorance. It was audacity. Coordinated. Funded. And cloaked in the smug armor of suburban entitlement. By midweek, the place looked like a goddamn festival ground. Portable stages went up, strung with fairy lights and garish banners that flapped like wounds in the wind. One read Live Free, Lake Proud, and featured a cartoon alligator wearing sunglasses. Irony didn't even bother showing up anymore. A pair of teenagers set up a toll booth at the trail entrance, charging $10 for VIP parking, which turned out to be an overgrown patch of wild grasses now flattened into ruts. I walked past them without a word, ignoring their chirped wristbands, sir, like they were mosquitoes I didn't have time to slap. Down by the water, a crew of shirtless young men hauled barrels of beer toward a tent labeled Karen's Cove, as if she'd conquered a kingdom with nothing but acrylic nails and HOA bylaws. What really got me, though, wasn't the noise or the trash or even the theft of land. It was the way the lake changed. The birds stopped coming. The frogs no longer croaked their evening lullaby. I hadn't seen the otter in over a week. And the reeds, once so thick with dragonflies you could hear the buzzing, now lay trampled, broken, sickly. The lake was retreating. Not physically, but spiritually. Like it was holding its breath, waiting to exhale in fury. Still, I held back. Documented. Called. Filed quiet complaints. Until I saw the Langstons. Mr. and Mrs. Langston had lived by the east bend of the lake longer than I had. Salt-of-the-earth types. Used to wave from their canoe every Sunday morning. Used to bake me corn muffins every fall when the first leaves dropped. So when I ran into them at the general store, I expected outrage. Solidarity. But their faces were pinched, polite, the way people look when they've swallowed something rotten but are pretending it's wine. It's for the good of the community, Mrs. Langston said without meeting my eye. Mr. Langston nodded like a puppet. We just have to adapt, you know? Things change. That's when I knew. Karen wasn't just throwing parties. She was buying silence. And some people, good people, had a price. I went digging. The county website was a mess of outdated PDFs and broken links, but buried beneath layers of administrative sludge, I found something curious. A business license. Community Event Solutions, LLC. Registered 4 months ago. Owner, Karen Mitchell. Purpose, consulting and event management for residential developments. Listed address, a P.O. box 2 towns over. She had created a shell company. Hired herself. Then billed the HOA for planning the very events she threw. That meant every wristband sold, every cup of beer poured, every toll collected, she got a cut. And the HOA board? Bought. Paid. Complicit. I talked to vendors when they thought no one important was listening. The guy inflating a bounce house let it slip. Karen's smart. Gets a slice of every vendor she books. It's all family and friends. Keeps it in the circle. He laughed, wiping sweat from his brow. Hell, I wish I had half her hustle. I didn't laugh. My blood had gone cold. This wasn't about community anymore. It wasn't even about noise or boundaries. It was theft. Manipulation. Environmental desecration wrapped in bunting and cheap beer. And worse, it was being applauded. That night, someone spray-painted my mailbox with a smiley face and the words "Lighten Up." My grass got a code violation for being half an inch too tall. A notice appeared taped to my door. Your cabin is currently under aesthetic compliance review. Karen's message was clear. Play nice or be erased. But the thing about people like Karen is they mistake quiet for weak. And that's always a mistake. Because some men wait not out of fear, but out of precision. I had waited 7 years for something like this. For someone so arrogant, so loud, so convinced they were untouchable, that they'd march straight into the jaws of the very thing they mocked. And I had jaws to offer. My alligators, once mocked as a quirky footnote in the land registry, now became my line in the sand. Registered under a Conservation Act no HOA lawyer could bend. Protected by federal law. Recognized as part of the ecological memory of the region. And I was their steward. Their watcher. Their silent partner. As the final flyers for Blackthorn Blowout went up, this time featuring drone light shows, a gator selfie station, and a glitter bar, I sat on my porch, the wind cool on my face, and knew this would be the last party. Not because I would stop it, but because the lake would. I just needed to give it time. 1 more day. Maybe 2. I watched the shadows lengthen over the water and whispered, not to God, but to something older. Something scaled and ancient, and very, very patient. I said, soon. And the lake did not answer. It never does. Not in words. It waits. Just like me. The morning the trucks came, I was already awake. I hadn't slept. The wind had shifted sometime after midnight, carrying with it the thick stench of diesel and synthetic lemon air freshener, the scent of temporary things trying too hard to seem permanent. I sat on my porch, boots on the railing, coffee blackasin clutched in both hands, and watched as the first convoy of Karen's dream arrived in a cloud of dust and arrogance. There were 6 vehicles in total. 3 were box trucks loaded with folding chairs, industrial-sized coolers, crates of plastic cups, and crates of something wrapped in blue tarps I'd later learn were bulk fireworks. 1 was a branded trailer advertising Florida's finest mobile bar experience, whatever that meant, and another towed a flatbed piled high with tiki torches, an inflatable water slide, and what looked suspiciously like a foam cannon. The last vehicle was a rental van from some suburban chain, out-of-state plates, windows obscured by sun shields. No logos. No decals. Just anonymity with a license plate. The men who spilled out of the trucks weren't the usual HOA volunteers in matching polos. These were contractors. Independent hires. The kind that got paid in cash and didn't ask questions. One of them wore a shirt that read "Events Get Lit" across the back. Another had a tattoo of a grenade on his neck. None of them seemed the least bit concerned with the land they were desecrating. They moved like ants on caffeine, efficient and loud, setting up tents and stages like they'd done this 100 times before, which they probably had. But not here. Not on this soil. Not under this sky. I stood and walked down the ridge, just far enough to watch without being seen, and I realized something strange. The lake was still. Too still. Usually, around this time of morning, you'd hear the loons first, then the frogs, then the soft rustle of reeds as the breeze picked up. But that day nothing. No birds. No ripples. Not even the wind dared to speak. The lake wasn't calm. It was holding its breath. That's how I knew we were close. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was complete. The shoreline, once sacred, jagged, imperfect, had been bulldozed into submission. Sand had been dumped to mimic a beach, plastic fencing staked in like barbed wire around a fortress. There were now designated fun zones, including a beer tent, a lake yoga area with color-coded mats, and a mechanical bull someone had set up dangerously close to the water. At one point I saw a group of teenagers struggling to carry a massive speaker stacked down to the dock. One of them slipped, and the entire system crashed to the ground, cracking one of the boards clean in half. They laughed. No one fixed it. I didn't say a word. I went back to my porch, made another pot of coffee, and waited. That night, Karen appeared. Not on the trail, not near the lake, but on local TV. Channel 9 News, standing in front of the Blackthorn Shores sign, speaking to a bleached smile anchor in a segment titled, Bringing Community Back. She wore her usual pastel blazer, hair sprayed stiff against the wind, and spoke with that polished confidence of someone who believed their own myth. This weekend isn't just a party, she said. It's a celebration of unity, of progress, of what can happen when neighbors come together and dream bigger. Blackthorn Blowout is the future of this lake, and I'm so proud of what we've created. Not preserved. Not protected. Created. As if the land had been waiting all this time for glitter and Bluetooth speakers to finally fulfill its purpose. I turned off the television. Not out of anger, but out of mourning. Somewhere deep in the forest behind me, an owl hooted once, low and final. Like a gavel. The next morning, I took a walk. Not down to the lake, but into the woods. Past the trails, past the old stone wall that once marked an 1800s boundary line, into the thicket where no one but animals dared to step. I didn't need to see the damage anymore. I needed to remember what this place had been. The moss was thicker here, untouched by the boots of tourists. The trees grew tighter together, branches interlaced like fingers of long-lost brothers. And in the center of that shaded silence, I found what I was looking for. A small clearing, barely larger than a kitchen, where the earth had sagged into a bowl and filled with dark, still water. Gator Pond, the locals used to call it. Not a pond, really. More like an ancestral scar. You didn't see the alligators at first. You felt them. The weight of ancient eyes watching. The tension of something just beneath, waiting. I crouched by the edge, careful not to break the silence. Then, as if summoned by thought alone, one surfaced. Not a monster. Not some snarling movie beast. Just a creature built for patience, for pressure, for balance. It looked at me the way it always did. Like a mirror. I nodded once. The wind picked up. That evening, Karen's final flyer hit the mailboxes. It was neon pink, laminated, printed on paper thick enough to be mistaken for a menu. Blackthorn Blowout. It screamed in bold cartoon font. Beach party extravaganza of the year. With bullet points, free beer. Jet ski races. Live DJ. Sunset foam pit. Midnight fireworks. Special surprise guests. All residents welcome. Guests must purchase wristbands. In smaller print at the bottom. By entering, you waive all liability. This is a community celebration. I held the flyer at arm's length like it might bite. It wasn't an invitation anymore. It was a challenge. Karen wasn't asking permission. She was daring anyone to stop her. The morning of the party, the sky was wrong. It wasn't stormy. It wasn't clear. It just hung there. Heavy. Like the world had inhaled and hadn't yet decided if it wanted to scream or collapse. Cars poured in by the dozens. Some residents, some not. I saw license plates from 3 different states. People dressed like they were headed to a music festival, not a conservation zone. Loud. Drunk before noon. Holding cans of seltzer and speakers the size of small refrigerators. A drone buzzed overhead, filming everything. Probably for HOA marketing or some online recap video. See how great we are. I stood on my porch and watched it all. A man offered me a wristband. I didn't respond. Just held up my mug. He backed away. By mid-afternoon, the music had started. Some mixture of country and EDM that turned the lake into a pulse. Kids screamed. Dogs barked. Someone revved a jet ski so hard it capsized. They cheered. The sun began to sink. And that's when it began. The shift. It always starts small. A silence in the reeds. A shadow that shouldn't be there. The water darkening not with nightfall, but with movement. And not human movement. The first scream didn't come until dusk. But when it did, it came sharp. Real. Followed by splashing. Followed by more screaming. I remained seated. I had waited 7 years for this. The lake was waking up. And nature never forgets. The scream that shattered the lake's silence wasn't the kind you could mistake for laughter or drunken bravado. It was sharp. Wet. Primal. The kind of sound a human mouth makes only when it remembers, too late, that it is still prey in the grand scheme of things. That sound echoed across the party like a starting gun, but no one ran at first. They turned. They tilted their heads like curious animals. It was dusk, and the lights they'd strung along the trees flickered to life, casting soft glows over beer tents and inflatable lounges, and that stupid foam pit already sagging under its own absurdity. For a moment, no one moved. And then came the second scream. Louder. Closer. Panicked. That one cracked the illusion. Phones went up. Heads turned. Someone laughed nervously and yelled, "Is this part of the show?" But deep down, even they knew better. Chaos doesn't come with a soundtrack. It comes with silence breaking like a bone. I stood from my chair and walked slowly toward the edge of the ridge. From my vantage point, I could see everything: the beach zone, the DJ booth, the water where the ripples were no longer playful. I saw two figures flailing waist deep, water churning around them in frantic circles. They stumbled, tried to run, but the lake has no floor, it only pretends to. One of them fell. That's when the crowd began to gather. Still no one helping, just watching, filming, their faces lit with the glow of screens. Then a third splash. A girl in a bright orange bikini waded in to pull someone out. She screamed, turned, stumbled backward, and blood, thin and sharp, ran down her leg in a lazy stream. The alligator didn't chase her. It didn't need to. It had already made its point. Panic bloomed like fire in dry grass. Screaming multiplied. Shouts and curses, and the crashing of coolers being overturned. Someone tried to pull down a banner to use as a stretcher. A man with a foam cowboy hat ran in circles shouting, "Where are the lifeguards?" There were none. There never were. Karen had hired volunteers, not safety staff. Teenagers paid in soda and favors, not trained responders. I heard someone shout my name. Distant. Muffled by fear. It didn't matter. What mattered was the lake. The water boiled with movement, not an explosion but a current, a stirring. The old bulls stayed deep. They always did. But the juveniles, the six-footers with fast minds and faster teeth, they were drawn to motion, to light, to the foolish sound of party music vibrating through water like a dinner bell. I made my way down the slope, not rushing, not intervening, just watching. Observing. The same way the lake did. When I reached the shore, people were scattering like ants. Someone had finally killed the music, but the silence that followed was worse. You could hear the breathing, the prayers, the pleading, and then the sirens. First one, then three, then five. Lights tore through the trees, red and blue against the soft orange of firelight. Because of course someone had lit a bonfire, and of course someone else had knocked it over, and now dry grass burned in a slow spiral toward the beer tent. Deputies arrived in a cloud of dust and shouted commands no one listened to. Wildlife officers followed, grim and soaked, dragging boats behind them. One of them, a tall woman with a ponytail and a machete strapped to her thigh, looked around the chaos and said simply, "Jesus Christ." I stood next to her, arms crossed. She glanced at me. "You Lancaster?" I nodded. "You the one who filed the sanctuary paperwork?" "That's me," I said, voice flat. "Registration number 4782 BL. Filed under the Rural Wetlands Conservation Act of 2016. She didn't ask more. Just nodded once and walked toward the water, barking orders. Deputies moved in groups, rounding up partygoers like strays. EMTs rushed toward the injured, for by my count, none dead, but at least two were in shock, limbs torn just enough to be humbling. And then the cameras arrived. The local news van screeched in behind the second fire truck. A reporter in heels and full makeup stepped out and began narrating like it was a parade instead of a collapse. Behind her, Karen stood with her glitter sash half ripped, mascara streaked down her cheeks, phone clenched in one trembling hand. She tried to speak, tried to command, but the crowd had turned. The same people who cheered her that morning now shouted her name with venom. "You said it was safe," someone screamed. "You said you had permits. Where's the first aid, Karen? Where's the goddamn lifeguards?" She backed away, eyes wide, lips moving but no sound coming out. One deputy approached her, a clipboard in hand, a badge gleaming. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw the moment when Karen realized the gravity of it all. Her knees buckled slightly. She reached for something that wasn't there. Support. Authority. Relevance. None of it answered. The deputy pointed toward the vendor tents, then toward the news cameras, then toward the lake. Her mouth moved fast, desperate, but the damage was done. The reporter turned her mic. "Sources confirm the site was not properly permitted," she announced, trying to keep her voice solemn while her eyes sparkled with the scent of scandal. "Multiple wildlife officers confirm this area is a registered sanctuary. The party was not only unapproved, but may constitute a federal violation." Karen stepped backward, then again, and finally she ran. Not a sprint, not a graceful exit. A clumsy, stumbling shuffle past folding chairs and spilled drinks and into the tree line. No one followed. The party ended in slow pieces. Officers leading dazed kids to ambulances. Vendors packing up in stunned silence. The DJ quietly dismantling his booth. Around midnight, the last jet ski was pulled from the water, its engine sputtering like a dying laugh. The gators had long since vanished, retreated back into the reeds, their message delivered. One of the wildlife officers turned to me, soaked and exhausted. "Hell of a thing," he said. I just nodded. "You're not in trouble," he added. "In fact, we might need your help documenting all this." "I'll be here," I said. "So will the lake." He didn't argue. Somewhere beyond the shoreline, a breeze stirred the water. A whisper of something older than parties or politics. A reminder. And as the last of the lights blinked out and the sirens faded into memory, the lake exhaled at last. The next morning the sky wore a kind of silence I hadn't heard in months. Not the tense, expectant hush of a storm on the horizon, but something different, weightless, like the forest had finally exhaled. I stood barefoot on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the mist roll in from the lake in ribbons that curled low and slow, as if reclaiming the air that had been stolen by sound and smoke. Across the water, the party was gone. What remained was wreckage. Plastic chairs overturned like fallen soldiers. Torn banners clinging to trees by single threads. Foam residue drying into a chalky crust on the rocks. And silence, thick and absolute, except for the crows that had returned overnight, already picking through what humanity had left behind. Deputies were the first to arrive. Not in urgency this time, but with slow, methodical purpose. Clipboards. Evidence bags. Polite nods. Then came the fire marshal's team, dressed in soot-marked gear, walking the perimeter of the scorched field that had once hosted Karen's bonfire dreams. They didn't speak much either. Just surveyed, scribbled, and occasionally pointed toward things no longer burning. By noon, the environmental agents showed up. They came with maps, printed satellite overlays, and a folder so thick it looked like it had weight enough to tip a scale. One of them, a tall woman with a badge clipped to her vest and permanent exhaustion in her voice, approached me at the fence line. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, flipping open a leather-bound notebook, "we're filing a formal complaint against the HOA." I nodded. "And Karen Mitchell personally," she added. "Violation of conservation codes. Illegal firework use. Unauthorized event hosting in a protected zone. Destruction of wildlife habitat." I said nothing. There wasn't anything left to say. That afternoon, the first lawsuit was filed. A personal injury claim from the girl in the orange bikini, whose shin now bore 4 neat puncture wounds, and a story she'd be telling bar strangers for years. Then came another, from one of the boys who'd been dragged out of the shallows by paramedics, his calf muscle torn just enough to make walking a memory for the season. By nightfall, 6 had been submitted. All of them named Karen. All of them named the HOA. And not a single one mentioned me. That was the beautiful thing about legality. You either respected it, or you paid for pretending it didn't exist. Over the next few days, the collapse went from quiet to cinematic. The HOA's board fractured like cheap glass under pressure. The treasurer resigned first, citing personal differences with the direction of community leadership. The secretary followed, posting a long-winded apology on social media about how she never knew the full extent of Karen's actions and had been misled about the permits. Even Deborah Myers, the one who'd championed the beautification subcommittee and personally spearheaded the offensive landscaping by the boat launch, issued a public statement denouncing Karen's flagrant abuse of HOA resources and promising to seek legal counsel. But Karen didn't go quietly. For 3 days she tried everything: interviews, statements, accusations. Claimed she'd been set up, that the permits had been mishandled by volunteers, that the gator sightings were exaggerated, that the sanctuary was misfiled, that I had manipulated the system. This was supposed to be joy, she sobbed into a news camera. A celebration of community. But by then the footage had aired. Multiple clips of her directing stage crews, laughing with vendors, giving speeches about her vision. Photos of her pouring beer. Signing vendor checks. Smiling next to the foam cannon. Testimonies from teenagers she'd underpaid, now ready to trade their loyalty for immunity. And then came my move. I hired a lawyer from the Capitol, someone who specialized in HOA overreach and knew how to weaponize bylaws like a scalpel. Together, we filed a counterclaim. It was 37 pages long, and every word of it carved deep. We demanded full restoration of the conservation zone, the permanent removal of any HOA authority from lands not under their direct ownership, financial damages for trespassing, harassment, and emotional distress. And we named Karen personally, for fraud, negligence, and endangering a protected wildlife population. Her lawyer tried to settle. Mine refused. In court, the judge raised an eyebrow before we'd even finished opening remarks. By the end of the first hearing, Karen's expression had collapsed into something haunted. Her house was seized for asset liquidation. Her accounts frozen. Her consulting company, Community Event Solutions LLC, was deemed fraudulent. The final blow came 2 months later when the state environmental office slapped the HOA with a $600,000 fine and a 10-year restriction on public events near any wetland property. The Blackthorn Shores Homeowners Association was dissolved within a week. All assets liquidated. The community center was sold to a church group that turned it into a free meal kitchen. The playground was bought by a local farm cooperative and relocated. The newsletter printing contract was canceled. Even the decorative lakefront signage, the kind Karen had posed beside in every photo, was pulled out by a city crew and fed through a wood chipper. What replaced it was nothing. Just the trees, the dirt, and silence. Karen left town before winter. No forwarding address. Her SUV packed full and gone before the sun was up. Rumor was she moved west. Started over. Changed her name. I didn't care. The lake didn't either. With the HOA gone and the party debris cleared, I spent a week just listening. Letting the quiet soak back into the cracks. Watching birds return. The herons. The frogs. The small things that never demanded attention but gave the land its song. Then, on a clear October morning, I got to work. It took a day and a half, a rented post digger, and a weather-sealed oak slab I'd been saving for years. I mounted it at the head of the gravel road. Burned the letters myself. Lake Gators Refuge. No trespassing. Seriously. Below that, on a small steel plaque, in memory of Blackthorn's original guardians, the ones with teeth. Now and then, a stranger drives down the road. Usually lost. They slow when they see the sign. They read it, and most of them, after a long pause, turn around. The ones who don't, well, no one makes the same mistake twice. I sit on my porch some evenings, coffee or something stronger in hand, and I watch the sun disappear behind the tree line. Sometimes I hear the splash of a tail in the reeds. Sometimes I see nothing at all. But I always feel it, the steady heartbeat of the lake, slow and eternal. Karen thought power came from rules and titles and public praise. But around here, power has teeth. And it waits. Quiet. Patient. Watching from just beneath the surface.